The rooftop antenna sparked once, then twice, and Mark Delaney barely had time to pull his hand back before a wave of white light swallowed him whole. 1 second he was standing on his sloped roof in Ohio with a wrench in his hand, and the next second the world simply disappeared. There was no pain. There was no sound. There was only a strange floating feeling, like falling asleep while standing up. When he opened his eyes again, he was not on his roof. He was strapped into a metal chair that curved around his back and shoulders, and the air smelled faintly of ozone, like the moment right after lightning strikes. A low hum vibrated through the floor beneath him, steady and endless, the kind of hum that told him he was not on solid ground anymore. He tried to move his arms and found them locked in place by soft restraints that gave slightly, but did not release. Around him, shapes moved, tall shapes. As his eyes adjusted to the dim blue lighting, he realized the shapes were people, or something close to people. Women, all of them, dressed in dark, fitted armor that caught the light like polished stone. Their skin had a faint silver undertone, and their eyes were sharper, brighter, somehow more alert than any human eyes he had seen. They walked in straight lines, calling out words to each other in a language that sounded like wind moving through metal pipes. Mark's heart pounded so hard he could feel it in his ears. He opened his mouth to speak, but only a dry croak came out. One of the women turned toward him. She was taller than the others, with short dark hair and a scar that ran along her jaw. She studied him the way someone studies a puzzle piece that does not seem to fit the picture. Then she reached toward his ear and clipped a small silver device onto it, cool against his skin. A moment later, her next words came through clearly, in perfect English, though her mouth was still moving in that strange rolling language. "New recruit," she said. "Batch 4. Processing now." "Recruit?" Mark managed to say. "I'm not a recruit. I don't know what's happening. I was on my roof. I was fixing a satellite dish." The woman blinked, the first sign of hesitation he had seen from her. She turned and spoke rapidly to someone behind her, and for a moment, Mark allowed himself a flicker of hope. Maybe this was a mistake. Maybe they would realize it, apologize, and send him home. But the restraints released with a soft click, and instead of leading him toward an exit, 2 women pulled him gently, but firmly to his feet, and guided him into a long line of other people. He turned his head as he was walked forward, and saw that the line stretched far down the corridor, dozens of figures standing shoulder to shoulder, waiting. None of them looked human. Most of them were like the woman with the scar, silver-skinned and tall, though a few had a faint blue tint to their skin, and stood a head shorter. Mark seemed to be the only person there who looked like he belonged on Earth. He tried again. "Please, listen to me. There has been some kind of mix-up. I'm not supposed to be here." A different woman, walking along the line with a datapad in her hand, glanced at him without much interest. "Every recruit says that in the first hour," she said, not unkindly, simply tired. "It passes." "No, you don't understand. I didn't volunteer for anything. I was just standing on my roof." "Name," she said, cutting him off, her stylus hovering over the pad. Mark hesitated, then gave up trying to argue, and answered honestly, "Mark Delaney." She tapped it in, frowned slightly at whatever appeared on her screen, and moved to the next person without another word. The line moved forward slowly. Mark used the time to look around, to try to understand where he was. The corridor was long and curved gently, following what he guessed was the shape of a massive ship. Every few meters, a window revealed a black sky, filled with more stars than he had ever seen from Earth, undimmed by clouds or city lights. Far in the distance, he could make out the curve of a planet that was definitely not his own, its surface a mixture of deep purple and green. His stomach turned. This was real. Whatever had happened to him on that roof, it had not been a dream, and he was not on Earth anymore. The line eventually brought him into a large open room filled with lockers and long benches. A stack of dark uniforms sat folded on a table near the entrance, each one marked with a small emblem that looked like 3 overlapping circles. The woman with the scar reappeared, standing near the front of the room with her arms crossed, watching the new recruits file in. "I am Commander Yisa Rook," she announced, her translated voice carrying easily across the room despite her calm tone. "You have been brought here because the recruitment beacon called to you. And you answered. Whatever confusion you feel now will fade as your training begins. This is the Draveth Sisterhood, and as of this moment, you are part of it. Mark raised his hand, feeling foolish even as he did it. I didn't answer any beacon. I don't even know what that means. Commander Rook's eyes moved to him, and for the first time, something like real curiosity crossed her face. She studied him for a long moment, taking in his plain clothes, his confused expression, the way he stood slightly apart from the others without meaning to. What is your world of origin? She asked. Earth, Mark said. I'm human. I don't think I'm supposed to be here at all. A ripple of murmurs passed through the recruits standing nearby. Several of the silver-skinned women turned to look at him more closely now, their expressions shifting from mild curiosity to open surprise. One of them, a younger recruit with striking pale eyes, leaned toward her neighbor and whispered something that made the other woman's eyebrows rise. Commander Rook held up a hand, and the murmuring stopped instantly. Humans do not answer recruitment beacons, she said slowly, more to herself than to him. Your world has not yet been contacted. Exactly, Mark said, relief flooding through him. So there's been a mistake. Can you send me back? Rook did not answer right away. She stepped closer, studying him the way a scientist studies an unexpected result. The beacon calibration for this sector targets 3 neighboring systems, she said. One of them borders your solar system's outer edge. It is possible the signal reached further than intended and pulled you in along with the others. Then it really was a mistake, Mark said. You have to send me home. Perhaps, Rook said, but recruitment errors are reviewed by Fleet Command, not by me. And Fleet Command is currently occupied with matters more urgent than one misplaced volunteer. Until a review is scheduled, you remain part of this unit. Mark felt his stomach drop. How long will that take? I do not know, Rook admitted. It could be a matter of days. It could be longer. Around him, the other recruits had begun collecting their uniforms from the table, their earlier interest in him fading as they focused on their own uncertain futures. Mark stood frozen for a moment, trying to process what he had just been told. He was stuck, not for an hour, not for a day, but for an unknown stretch of time, on a ship full of alien women, preparing for some kind of combat, with no way to explain to his job, his neighbors, or anyone back home where he had gone. What am I supposed to do until then? He finally asked. Rook's expression did not soften, but something in her voice changed slightly, as though she were making a decision on the spot. You will train with the others, she said. It is safer for everyone, including you, if you understand our procedures while you wait. An untrained body on this ship is a liability, whether human or otherwise. She gestured toward the table, and one of the younger recruits, the one with pale eyes, stepped forward and picked up a folded uniform, offering it to him. He took it hesitantly, the fabric cool and strange under his fingers, lighter than it looked but somehow sturdy. I am Elena, the young recruit said, her voice carrying a note of genuine warmth that surprised him after the coldness of the processing line. You should change quickly. The commander does not like people who move too slowly. Mark looked down at the uniform in his hands, then back up at the room full of unfamiliar faces, the strange lighting, the distant view of stars through the narrow windows. Everything about this moment felt impossible, like a dream he could not wake up from no matter how hard he tried. But the fabric in his hands was real. The hum of the ship beneath his feet was real, and somewhere far behind him, Earth kept spinning without him, unaware that one of its own had been swept up into something far bigger than a satellite dish repair. Okay, he said quietly, more to himself than to anyone else. Okay, I'll change. Elena gave him a small, encouraging nod before turning to help another confused recruit sort through the pile of gear. Commander Rook remained standing near the front of the room, watching Mark for a moment longer than necessary before turning to address the rest of the new arrivals, her voice rising to carry across the space. Training begins in 1 hour, she announced. Report to the lower deck when the signal sounds. Those who are late will regret it. The room stirred into motion, recruits scattering toward lockers and changing areas, voices rising in a mixture of languages that the translator device struggled to keep up with. Mark stood in the middle of it all, uniform clutched against his chest, feeling smaller, and more out of place than he ever had in his life. He had come up to his roof that morning to fix a simple problem with a satellite dish. Now he was standing on an alien warship, somewhere among the stars, about to be trained for something he did not understand, surrounded by women who fought battles he could not begin to imagine. Whatever recruitment beacon had reached across the void and pulled him from his rooftop, it had made a mistake. But mistakes, he was quickly learning, did not always get corrected quickly. Sometimes they simply had to be lived through. He took a slow breath, steadying himself as best he could, and began to change into the uniform. Whatever happened next, he had exactly 1 hour to prepare for it, and something told him that 1 hour was not going to be nearly enough. In the corridor outside, unseen by him, Commander Rook lingered a moment longer, staring at the closed door with a thoughtful expression. She pulled up the recruitment log on her datapad, scrolling through the entry marked with his name, the small red flag beside it indicating an unresolved origin discrepancy. Her thumb hovered over the button that would send the error directly to Fleet Command for immediate review. She did not press it. Instead, she closed the file, turned, and walked away down the humming corridor, already thinking about how a human body, untrained and unprepared, was going to survive the first day of Dravith training. The signal that called Mark down to the lower deck was not a bell or an alarm, but a deep pulse that seemed to vibrate through the floor itself, rising up through his boots and into his chest. He arrived with seconds to spare, breathing hard from jogging through unfamiliar corridors, and found himself standing at the edge of a massive open chamber, unlike anything he had ever seen. The room stretched upward for what looked like 10 stories, its walls lined with strange equipment, hanging cables, and platforms that floated without any visible support. Recruits from the earlier processing line stood scattered across the floor in loose clusters, some stretching, some talking quietly, all of them watching the open space with a mixture of nerves and anticipation. Elena spotted him and waved him over, her pale eyes bright with the same excitement she had shown earlier. "You made it," she said, barely. "I got lost twice," Mark admitted, still catching his breath. "This ship doesn't exactly come with a map." "You will learn it," Elena said simply, as though this were an obvious fact. "Everyone does, some faster than others." Before Mark could ask what she meant by that, the pulse sounded again, sharper this time, and every recruit in the chamber snapped into a straight line facing the center of the room. Mark scrambled to follow, standing slightly crooked between Elena and a tall recruit with dark blue skin who eyed him with open suspicion. Commander Rook walked out onto a raised platform above them, her boots clicking against the metal with each measured step. Beside her stood another officer, shorter and broader, with cropped silver hair and a permanent frown etched into her face. Rook introduced her simply as Officer Tessu, the unit's lead trainer, and the frown deepened as Tessu's gaze swept across the new recruits, lingering longest on Mark. "Today you learn the first lesson of the Dravith Sisterhood," Rook announced, her voice carrying easily to every corner of the chamber. "Your body belongs to your training now. Whatever weakness you carried onto this ship, you will leave behind on this floor." Tessu stepped forward and raised a small device, and without warning, the gravity in the chamber shifted. Mark felt his stomach lurch as his feet lifted slightly off the ground, his balance thrown completely off. Around him, recruits who had clearly trained before adjusted almost instantly, planting their feet at strange angles and finding their footing in the reduced gravity. Mark had no such experience, and within seconds he was floating awkwardly sideways, arms flailing, while a ripple of quiet laughter passed through the nearby recruits. "Focus on your core," Elena called to him, somehow steady despite the shifting gravity, her boots gripping the floor through some technique he did not understand. "Do not fight it, move with it." Mark tried to twist his body the way she showed him, but he only succeeded in spinning himself further off balance, drifting toward the tall blue-skinned recruit, who shoved him away with obvious irritation. He hit the floor hard, the reduced gravity softening the impact but not his embarrassment. From the platform above, Tessu's frown deepened even further. "The human struggles," she said loudly enough for the whole room to hear. Perhaps he should return to his rooftop, where gravity behaves the way he expects. A few recruits laughed openly this time. Mark felt his face burn, but he pushed himself back to his feet, refusing to look away from Tessu's cold stare. I'm still learning, he said. Give me a minute. We do not have a minute, Tessu replied. We have this training cycle, and then the next, and the one after that, until either you learn or you fail. Choose quickly. Something about her tone, the flat certainty in it, lit a small, stubborn fire in Mark's chest. He had spent his whole life fixing things that broke, solving problems that seemed impossible, until suddenly they were not. He planted his feet the way Elena had shown him, bent his knees slightly, and forced himself to breathe slowly instead of panicking. The next attempt was better. Not good, but better. He managed to stay upright for several seconds before the shifting gravity threw him off again, but this time, he caught himself before hitting the ground, using a nearby railing to steady his body. Tessu said nothing, but Mark caught the faint narrowing of Commander Rook's eyes from the platform above, an expression that looked almost like reluctant interest. The training continued for hours. After the gravity drills came weapons training, where Mark was handed a long, thin device that hummed faintly in his palm. Elena explained quietly that it was a pulse rod, a weapon that could stun an opponent without causing lasting harm, standard equipment for training exercises. Mark fumbled with it awkwardly at first, activating it by accident and sending a jolt of energy into the floor that made several recruits jump. You are holding it like a broom, the blue-skinned recruit muttered, not bothering to hide her contempt. Her name, Mark had learned, was Drenna, and she seemed to have decided within the first hour that he did not belong among them. I've never held one of these before today, Mark said, trying to keep his voice even. I'm doing my best. Your best is slowing down the rest of us, Drenna shot back. Every moment spent teaching you the basics is a moment we lose learning something advanced. Elena stepped between them, before the exchange could grow sharper. Everyone starts somewhere, she said firmly. You forget your own first day, Drenna. I remember it. You could not even activate your rod without shocking yourself. A few nearby recruits snickered, and Drenna's cheeks darkened with something that looked like embarrassment beneath her blue skin. She said nothing more, but the look she gave Mark before turning away promised that this was not the end of the matter. By the time the training cycle ended, Mark's arms ached in places he did not know could ache, and his legs felt like they belonged to someone else entirely. He collapsed onto a bench in the changing room, barely able to lift his own boots to remove them. Elena sat down beside him, looking considerably less exhausted, though a light sheen of sweat did cover her forehead. You did better than I expected, she said. I fell down about 40 times, Mark replied. 37, Elena corrected, a small smile playing at the corner of her mouth. I counted. Despite his exhaustion, Mark found himself laughing quietly, the sound surprising him. It was the first time since waking up on this ship that he had felt anything close to normal. Why are you being nice to me? He asked, genuinely curious. Everyone else looks at me like I'm some kind of mistake that wandered onto their ship. Elena considered the question seriously before answering. Because you are trying, she said. Most people who do not belong somewhere either give up immediately or pretend they belong there more than anyone else. You are doing neither. You are simply trying to learn, even though you are afraid. I respect that. Mark did not know how to respond to that, so he simply nodded and let the compliment settle over him, small but warm. Over the following days, a routine began to take shape, though Mark never stopped feeling like an outsider looking in. Mornings began with the gravity drills, which slowly became less humiliating as his body adjusted to the constant shifts. Afternoons were spent on weapons training and tactical simulations, where holographic enemies appeared across the training floor, and recruits practiced coordinated defense patterns. Evenings brought lessons on ship systems, alien geography, and the strange, sprawling history of the Dravith sisterhood, none of which Mark fully understood, but all of which he absorbed as best he could. Commander Rook watched him more closely than he realized. She rarely spoke to him directly, but she appeared at the edges of training sessions often enough that Mark began to notice the pattern. She observed his mistakes without comment, watched his slow improvements without praise, and seemed, more than anything, to be waiting for something. It was during one such session, nearly a week into his unplanned stay, that things nearly went very wrong. The exercise that day involved a simulated defense scenario, where recruits worked in pairs to hold a position against waves of holographic attackers. Mark had been paired with Elena, and the two of them had developed a rough but workable rhythm, her guiding his movements while he provided the raw effort his still-developing skills allowed. Midway through the exercise, the equipment controlling the simulation malfunctioned. Instead of the usual holographic projections, which caused no real harm, the system briefly activated a set of physical training drones, fast-moving machines designed for advanced recruits, not beginners like Mark. One of the drones shot toward him at a speed he had no chance of dodging on his own. Elena shouted a warning and shoved him hard to the side, throwing herself between him and the oncoming drone. The impact sent her tumbling across the floor, and for one terrifying second, Mark thought she had been seriously hurt. But the drone's stun setting, though far stronger than intended for a training scenario, left her only dazed and struggling to catch her breath. Alarms sounded immediately, and technicians rushed onto the floor to shut down the malfunctioning equipment. Mark scrambled to Elena's side, helping her sit up as medical staff arrived. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice shaking more than he expected. "I will be fine," Elena said, wincing as she rubbed her shoulder. "That drone hits harder than it should." "You didn't have to do that," Mark said. "You could have let me handle it." Elena looked at him with an expression that was somewhere between amusement and disbelief. "You have been training for 1 week," she said. "I have been training for 3 years. There was no version of that moment where you handled it successfully." Commander Rook arrived moments later, her expression unreadable as she surveyed the scene, questioning the technicians about the malfunction, while medical staff checked Elena for any lasting injury. When she finally turned her attention to Mark, her gaze lingered on him for a long moment. "You are unharmed," she said. It was not quite a question. "Because of her," Mark said, nodding toward Elena. "She saved me." "I am aware," Rook said. "I watched the recording." She paused, studying him with an intensity that made him distinctly uncomfortable. "Tell me, human, if the drone had been aimed at her instead of you, what would you have done?" Mark did not hesitate. "I would have tried to stop it, even if I didn't know how." Something shifted in Rook's expression, subtle but unmistakable, a flicker of genuine consideration rather than simple assessment. She said nothing more, but she did not walk away immediately either, remaining nearby as the technicians finished their repairs and the recruits were dismissed for the evening. That night, alone in the small quarters he had been assigned, Mark sat on the edge of his narrow bed and allowed himself to think, really think, about everything that had happened since the moment the light swallowed him on his rooftop. He thought about Elena throwing herself in front of a drone for someone she had known only a few days. He thought about Drenna's open hostility, and Tessu's cold judgment, and Commander Rook's quiet, watchful presence that seemed to follow him everywhere without ever fully revealing its purpose. He thought about home too, about his empty apartment, his job that would soon notice his absence, the life he had left behind without any warning or goodbye. But strangely, when he tried to picture that life clearly, it felt distant now, like a memory belonging to someone else. Somewhere above him, unseen, Commander Rook sat in her private quarters, reviewing the same recruitment log she had closed a week earlier, the red flag beside Mark's name still blinking, still unresolved. Her thumb hovered over the report button once again. Once again, she did not press it. Instead, she opened a new file, one that tracked recruit performance and potential, and began typing notes about a human who had arrived by accident and refused, so far, to leave quietly. News traveled fast on a ship as large as the one Mark now called home, faster than he ever would have guessed possible. Within 2 weeks of his arrival, it seemed every officer, technician, and off-duty recruit on board had heard some version of the story, each one more exaggerated than the last. By the time the rumors reached the farthest corners of the fleet, Mark had apparently grown 3 inches taller, defeated a training drone with his bare hands, and single-handedly redesigned half the weapons systems, none of which bore any resemblance to what had actually happened. He first noticed the shift during a routine meal in the communal dining hall. Normally, recruits from his training group sat together at a long table near the back, mostly ignoring him unless direct interaction was unavoidable. That day, as he carried his tray toward the usual spot, he noticed an unfamiliar cluster of women watching him from a nearby table, whispering behind cupped hands, their eyes tracking his every movement. "Ignore them," Elena advised, sliding into the seat across from him with her own tray. They are curious, that is all. Curious about what exactly? Mark asked, sitting down carefully, aware of the stares following him. About you, Elena said, as though the answer were obvious. Human men are rare in this part of the fleet. Most of us have never encountered one before. And the story of your arrival has become, let us say, popular. Mark set down his fork, appetite suddenly diminished. Popular how? Before Elena could answer, a woman he did not recognize approached their table, tall and confident, wearing the insignia of a different unit entirely. She stopped directly across from Mark, studying him with open, unguarded interest. So you are the one, she said, her translated voice carrying a note of amusement. The accidental recruit. I had to see for myself. That's me, Mark said awkwardly, unsure how else to respond. Mark Delaney. Accidental recruit, apparently. The woman smiled, introduced herself briefly as an officer named Cora, from a neighboring unit, and asked him a series of rapid questions about Earth, about his life before the ship, about how he had adjusted to training. Mark answered as best he could, increasingly aware of the small crowd that had begun gathering nearby, listening in without any pretense of subtlety. By the end of the meal, 3 more officers from other units had stopped by the table, each one introducing themselves, each one asking similar questions, with similar curious expressions. Elena watched the growing attention with an expression Mark could not quite read, somewhere between amusement and quiet concern. This is not normal, she finally said, once the crowd had thinned enough to allow private conversation. Officers from other units do not typically visit our dining hall without reason. So what changed? Mark asked. You did, Elena said simply. Or rather, the story of you did. The attention only grew over the following days. Requests for transfers into Mark's training group increased noticeably, officers citing vague administrative reasons that seemed to satisfy no one, but were approved regardless. During training sessions, Mark caught unfamiliar faces watching from the observation platforms above the chamber, whispering to each other as he stumbled through gravity drills or fumbled with his pulse rod. Not everyone found the attention charming. Drenna's hostility, already sharp before the sudden fame, curdled into something colder and more calculated. She began finding small ways to undermine him during training, positioning herself to block his movements during drills, offering incorrect guidance during weapons practice that she claimed afterward was simple misunderstanding. Tessu, the lead trainer, seemed equally unimpressed by the growing spectacle. During one particularly difficult session, she pulled Mark aside after the others had been dismissed, her expression as cold and unreadable as ever. You understand this attention changes nothing, she said, without preamble. Whatever curiosity others hold for your presence, it does not excuse weakness on this training floor. If anything, it makes your failures more visible, not less. I'm not trying to be a spectacle, Mark said, frustration creeping into his voice, despite his effort to stay calm. I didn't ask for any of this. Perhaps not, Tessu said, but you have it regardless, and how you handle it will determine whether you are remembered as a recruit who earned his place, or as a curiosity who wasted everyone's time and attention. The words stung more than Mark wanted to admit, partly because some quiet part of him feared she might be right. He had spent every day since his arrival simply trying to survive training, to avoid embarrassing himself further, to somehow make sense of a life that had been upended without warning. He had not stopped to consider how others might be judging his presence, weighing whether he deserved to be there at all. That night, unable to sleep, he made his way to one of the ship's observation decks, a quiet space near the upper levels where large windows looked out onto the endless field of stars. He had discovered the spot during his second week aboard, and had returned to it several times since, finding a strange comfort in the vastness of space, so different from anything he had known on Earth, yet somehow calming in its own way. He was not alone this time. Commander Rook stood near the far window, her hands clasped behind her back, gazing out at the stars with an expression of quiet contemplation. She glanced over as he approached, neither inviting him closer nor asking him to leave. "Trouble sleeping?" she asked, her voice softer than he had heard it before, without the sharp authority that usually colored her words. "Something like that," Mark admitted, coming to stand a respectful distance away, looking out at the same endless field of stars. It's a lot to process. All of this, the training, the attention, everything. Rook was quiet for a long moment. The attention will fade, she finally said. Curiosity always does, eventually. What remains after it fades is what matters. And what if what remains isn't good enough? Mark asked, the question slipping out before he could stop it. What if I'm just not built for this? Rook turned to look at him fully now, her expression thoughtful rather than dismissive. I have commanded this unit for 11 years, she said. I have seen recruits who arrived eager and confident fail within their first month, and I have seen recruits who arrived afraid and uncertain become some of the finest soldiers this fleet has ever known. Confidence is not the measure of capability, persistence is. That almost sounded like encouragement, Mark said, a small smile tugging at his mouth despite everything. Do not grow accustomed to it, Rook replied, though something in her tone suggested she was not entirely serious. She turned back to the window, and for a while, the two of them simply stood together in comfortable silence, watching the stars drift slowly past. The following morning brought a different kind of visitor entirely. A woman arrived on the training floor wearing unfamiliar insignia, sharper and more angular than the Dravith uniforms, her expression carrying none of the curious warmth that had characterized most of the previous visitors. She introduced herself as Officer Vesic, representing a unit from a neighboring sector, and requested permission to observe a full training session. Commander Rook granted the request, though Mark noticed a slight tension in her posture that had not been present during previous visits. Elena, standing nearby, leaned close to whisper an explanation. Vesic's unit does not typically visit for curiosity, she murmured. They are scouts, tasked with assessing strength across allied units. If she is here, it is not simply to see the human recruit. She is evaluating something. Evaluating what? Mark asked, uneasy. I do not know, Elena admitted. But her presence rarely means good news. The training session that followed felt different from any before it, sharper and more demanding, as though Commander Rook wanted to demonstrate the unit's genuine capability, rather than allow Vesic to see only a curiosity on display. Mark found himself pushed harder than usual, the gravity drills more punishing, the weapons exercises faster paced, the tactical simulations more complex. He struggled, as he often did, but something had shifted in the weeks since his arrival. His footing during the gravity drills, once hopelessly clumsy, now held steady more often than not. His grip on the pulse rod, once accidental and dangerous, now felt natural in his hand, responsive to his movements, rather than fighting against them. He was not skilled, not yet, not compared to recruits who had trained for years, but he was no longer simply falling down. Vesic watched the entire session from the observation platform, her expression unreadable, occasionally exchanging quiet words with an aide standing beside her. When the session ended, she approached Commander Rook directly, and Mark, still catching his breath nearby, caught fragments of their conversation, carried by the acoustics of the chamber. The human recruit, Vesic said, her tone carefully neutral. His presence has drawn considerable attention across the fleet. Some would call it a distraction. Some would call many things distractions, Rook replied evenly. My unit's performance speaks for itself, regardless of what draws attention to it. Performance can be affected by morale, Vesic countered, and morale can be affected by novelty. I simply wonder whether the novelty will fade before it causes genuine harm. Rook's expression did not change, but something in her posture stiffened slightly. My recruits are disciplined, she said. Whatever curiosity exists regarding one individual does not compromise the readiness of this unit. I would remind you that assessment of internal matters falls to my command, not to visiting scouts. Vesic inclined her head, a gesture that might have been respect, or might have been simple acknowledgement of a boundary she had no authority to cross. Of course, Commander. I only observe and report. What Fleet Command chooses to do with my observations is not my concern. She left shortly after, her aide trailing behind her, and the training floor settled back into its usual rhythm, though Mark could not shake the unease her visit had left behind. That evening, he found Elena in the dining hall and asked her directly what she thought Vesic's true purpose had been. Scouts like her report on many things, Elena said carefully. Troop readiness, morale, potential weaknesses that enemies might exploit. If word of your presence has spread far enough to draw attention from her unit, it may have spread further still, to places less friendly than ours. You think I could be a target, Mark said slowly, the realization settling over him like cold water. I think, Elena said, choosing her words with unusual care, that novelty draws attention from all directions, not only the kind that smiles at you in a dining hall. The warning lingered in Mark's mind over the following days, coloring every strange glance, every unfamiliar face that appeared near the training floor. He tried to push the worry aside, focusing instead on the steady, grinding work of improvement, determined to prove himself capable of more than curiosity, regardless of who might be watching. Drenna's hostility, meanwhile, reached a breaking point during a live simulation exercise nearly 3 weeks after Vesik's visit. The exercise required paired recruits to navigate a defensive scenario against increasingly difficult waves of holographic attackers, testing coordination and trust as much as individual skill. Mark had been paired, much to his discomfort, with Drenna herself, a pairing arrangement Tessu had insisted upon, claiming it would test his adaptability. The exercise began smoothly enough, though Drenna's movements remained sharp and unnecessarily aggressive, more focused on demonstrating her own skill than coordinating effectively with her partner. Midway through the third wave of attackers, Mark spotted an opening in their formation and called out a suggested repositioning, one that would have covered a gap in their shared defense. Drenna ignored him entirely, moving instead in the opposite direction, leaving the gap he had identified completely exposed. A holographic attacker exploited the opening instantly, and though the simulation carried no real danger, the failure registered clearly on the overhead display, marking their pairing as unsuccessful for that wave. You left the gap open on purpose, Mark said afterward, unable to hide his frustration as they exited the training floor. I made a tactical decision, Drenna replied coolly, one you were not qualified to evaluate. It cost us the wave, Mark pressed. Everyone saw it. Drenna's expression hardened. Perhaps everyone should see it, she said. Perhaps it is time this unit remembered that skill is earned, not granted by accident. You do not belong on this training floor, human, and no amount of attention from other units will change that fact. The confrontation drew a small crowd, recruits pausing to watch the exchange with varying degrees of discomfort. Elena stepped forward to intervene, but before she could speak, Commander Rook's voice cut through the tension from the edge of the gathered crowd, sharp and commanding. Officer Drenna, Rook said, her tone leaving no room for argument. A deliberate failure during a training exercise is not a tactical decision. It is insubordination. Report to my office immediately. Drenna's face paled slightly, though her posture remained defiant, even as she turned to comply with the order. Mark watched her go, a strange mixture of vindication and discomfort settling in his chest. He had not wanted to cause trouble for her, not really, but her hostility had made real cooperation impossible, and something had needed to break eventually. Commander Rook approached him once the crowd had dispersed, her expression carefully neutral. You did not provoke that confrontation, she said. I reviewed the recording. Your assessment of the tactical gap was correct. It doesn't feel like much of a victory, Mark admitted. She hates me because I'm here, and I can't exactly change that. Hatred born of insecurity rarely responds to reason, Rook said. It will resolve itself, one way or another, in time. She paused, studying him with an expression he had come to recognize as careful consideration. You have improved a great deal since your arrival, more than I expected. Is that a compliment? Mark asked, allowing a small smile despite the tension of the day. It is an observation, Rook replied, though the faintest hint of warmth touched her voice. Do not let it distract you. Whatever attention follows you now, from curious officers or hostile recruits, greater challenges remain ahead. I would rather you focus your energy there. Mark did not fully understand what she meant by greater challenges until 3 days later, when the alarm sounded across the entire ship, sharp and urgent, unlike anything he had heard during his time aboard. Recruits scrambled from their quarters, pulling on gear as officers shouted orders through every corridor, and Mark, caught in the sudden chaos, felt his stomach drop as Elena grabbed his arm and pulled him toward the training floor, her expression tighter and more serious than he had ever seen it. What's happening? he shouted over the noise. Enemy scout ships, Elena called back. Detected at the outer perimeter. This is not a drill. The training floor, usually a space of measured drills and controlled exercises, had transformed into something entirely different. Officers moved between clusters of recruits, distributing real weapons in place of the practice pulse rods, checking armor seals with quick, efficient hands, calling out assignments in clipped, urgent tones. The calm hum that normally filled the ship had sharpened into something with an edge, a vibration that Mark could feel in his teeth. Enemy scout ships, Elena repeated, checking the seals on his armor with practice speed, despite her own obvious tension. Small vessels, fast, difficult to track. If they are probing our perimeter, it likely means a larger force is not far behind. What does that mean for us? Mark asked, trying to keep his voice steady, even as his hands trembled slightly while he adjusted his own gear. It means we may be called to defend this section of the fleet, Elena said, depending on how the scouts report back. Commander Rook appeared moments later, moving through the chaos with a calm that seemed to steady everyone around her simply through proximity. She addressed the assembled recruits in short, clear sentences, assigning defensive positions along the ship's outer corridors, explaining evacuation routes for non-essential personnel, outlining the basic protocol for engaging hostile forces should they breach the perimeter. When she reached Mark, she paused. You have trained for 1 month, she said, her voice quieter than the commands she had given the others, meant only for him. That is not enough time to prepare for real combat. I know, Mark said, forcing himself to meet her eyes, despite the fear tightening his chest. But I'm not going to hide while everyone else fights. Rook studied him for a long moment, weighing something Mark could not fully read in her expression. You will be assigned to the secondary defense line, she finally said. Support duty only. You will follow every order without hesitation, and you will not attempt to prove anything beyond simply staying alive. Do you understand? Understood, Mark said, and meant it. The next hour passed in a blur of preparation, recruits moving into assigned positions along the ship's outer corridors, sealing bulkheads, activating defensive systems that hummed to life along the walls. Mark found himself stationed near a support station alongside Elena and 2 other recruits, tasked with managing emergency medical supplies and relaying communications between defensive positions, a role that felt simultaneously important and frustratingly passive, given the danger unfolding elsewhere on the ship. The first sign of real trouble came not as an alarm, but as a shudder that ran through the entire vessel, throwing several recruits off balance and rattling loose equipment from nearby shelves. Elena grabbed the edge of the support station to steady herself, her expression sharpening with focus. They have engaged the outer defenses, she said, glancing at a nearby display that flickered with rapidly updating information. Multiple contacts. This is larger than a simple scouting mission. Reports began flowing through the communication channels, officers calling out updates in tense, clipped voices. The enemy force, larger than initially estimated, had launched a coordinated assault on the fleet's outer perimeter defenses, aiming to breach the shield network protecting the vessel Mark now called home. Defensive units scrambled to respond, and within the training corridors, tension stretched taut as recruits waited for orders that would send them into the fight or keep them holding their positions. Mark's role, initially limited to supply management, shifted abruptly when a second shudder rocked the ship, more violent than the first, followed immediately by an alarm indicating a breach along one of the lower corridors. Officer Tessu's voice crackled through the communication channel, sharp with urgency. Breach confirmed. Lower Deck 7. All available support personnel to reinforce the defensive line immediately. Elena was moving before the announcement finished, grabbing her weapon and gesturing sharply for Mark to follow. That is us, she said. Move. They ran through corridors that had grown eerily quiet, the usual hum of the ship's systems replaced by the distant sound of impacts and the occasional flash of emergency lighting cycling red along the walls. When they reached Lower Deck 7, the scene that greeted them was chaos barely held together by discipline. A section of the outer wall had been breached, sparks and smoke pouring from damaged systems, while a small group of defenders held a narrow choke point against advancing enemy forces pushing through the gap. Commander Rook stood near the front of the defensive line, directing recruits with sharp, precise commands, her weapon steady in her hands, despite the chaos surrounding her. She spotted Mark and Elena as they arrived and gestured them toward a secondary position, tasked with covering a side corridor that connected to the main breach point. "Hold this position," she called to them. "If anything comes through that corridor, you fall back immediately and seal the bulkhead behind you. Do not engage directly unless there is no other option." Mark nodded, his heart pounding so loudly he could barely hear his own thoughts, and took up position beside Elena at the mouth of the side corridor, weapon raised, watching the shadows for any sign of movement. For several long minutes, nothing happened beyond the distant sounds of the main engagement. Mark's arms began to ache from holding his weapon steady, and sweat gathered along his hairline despite the cool air circulating through the ship's systems. Beside him, Elena remained perfectly still, her focus unwavering, a stark contrast to the nervous energy coursing through him. Then the corridor lights flickered, once, twice, and a shape emerged from the darkness ahead, moving low and fast. "Contact," Elena called sharply, raising her weapon. The enemy soldier, armored in dark plating unlike anything Mark had seen among the Dravith forces, moved with startling speed, closing the distance before either of them could react fully. Elena fired first, her shot striking the soldier's shoulder and knocking them briefly off balance, but the enemy recovered quickly, raising their own weapon toward her. Without thinking, Mark stepped forward and fired his own weapon, the pulse striking true and knocking the enemy soldier fully off their feet, weapon skittering across the floor. The soldier did not rise again, stunned by the combined impact of both shots. For a moment, neither Mark nor Elena moved, both staring at the fallen enemy soldier, as the adrenaline of the encounter slowly drained from their systems. "You did it," Elena finally said, disbelief coloring her voice. "You actually did it." "I didn't think," Mark admitted, his hands still shaking around his weapon. "I just reacted." "That is often how it happens," Elena said, a small, relieved smile breaking through her earlier tension. "The training becomes instinct before you notice it happening." Their relief was short-lived. A second wave of movement echoed from deeper in the corridor, and this time, more than one shape emerged from the shadows, moving with coordinated precision that suggested a larger force pressing forward. Elena's communication device crackled to life, Commander Rook's voice cutting through with urgent clarity. "Secondary breach confirmed at your position. Fall back and seal the bulkhead, immediately." "We can hold a little longer," Elena argued, even as she began backing toward the bulkhead controls. "If we fall back now, they gain ground on the main line." "That is an order, not a request," Rook replied, her voice sharp with an edge Mark had not heard from her before. "Fall back now." Mark grabbed Elena's arm, pulling her toward the bulkhead controls despite her hesitation. "She's right," he said. "We can't hold this position alone. Let's go." Elena's jaw tightened, but she nodded, and together they retreated toward the bulkhead, firing controlled shots to slow the advancing enemy forces as they moved. Mark reached the control panel first, his fingers fumbling briefly with the unfamiliar interface, before finding the correct sequence Elena had taught him during an early training session, one he had never expected to actually need. The bulkhead began sliding shut, just as the first enemy soldiers reached the gap, and Mark felt a surge of panic as one of them lunged forward, attempting to force their way through before the door sealed completely. Elena fired a precise shot that forced the soldier back, and the bulkhead slammed shut a heartbeat later, sealing the corridor and cutting off the advancing force. Silence fell in the aftermath, broken only by their own ragged breathing and the muffled sounds of impacts against the sealed door. "That was too close," Elena said, leaning against the wall for a moment, catching her breath. "Yeah," Mark agreed, his legs feeling unsteady beneath him. "Way too close." They made their way back toward the main defensive line, where the larger engagement had begun to shift in the Dravith Sisterhood's favor. Reinforcements had arrived from other sections of the fleet, and the enemy force, unable to break through the reinforced perimeter, had begun a slow, contested retreat. By the time Mark and Elena reached the main corridor, Commander Rook stood at the center of the defensive line, directing the final phases of the engagement, with the same calm precision she had shown throughout. The enemy retreat completed within another hour, their remaining scout ships withdrawing back toward the outer edges of the sector, leaving the fleet's perimeter damaged but ultimately intact. As the alarms finally quieted and emergency lighting shifted back to normal, exhausted recruits began gathering in the main corridor, checking on each other, tending to minor injuries, processing the reality of what had just occurred. Commander Rook found Mark and Elena near the edge of the gathering, her expression difficult to read as she approached. "You disobeyed a direct order," she said to Elena first, her tone stern. "I hesitated," Elena admitted. "But we followed it in the end." Rook's gaze shifted to Mark. "And you," she said. "You engaged an enemy combatant directly, despite being assigned to support duty only." Mark braced himself for reprimand, but instead, something in Rook's expression softened slightly. "You also protected your partner and secured a defensive breach without further casualties," she continued. "Reckless, perhaps, but effective." "Does that mean I'm not in trouble?" Mark asked cautiously. "It means," Rook said, "that we will discuss protocol another time. For now, I am simply relieved you are both unharmed." The admission, small as it was, carried more weight than any official commendation could have. Mark felt something shift in his chest, a strange mixture of exhaustion and quiet pride, as he looked around at the recruits gathered in the corridor, recovering together from an ordeal none of them had expected to face so soon. Drenna appeared among the gathered recruits as well, her earlier hostility notably absent as she approached the small group. She looked at Mark for a long moment, an unreadable expression crossing her face before she spoke. "You held the side corridor," she said, not quite a question. "We did," Mark said carefully, unsure what to expect. "That corridor connected directly to the medical bay," Drenna said. "If it had been breached fully, before reinforcements arrived, the injured recruits already being treated there would have been exposed to direct attack." Mark had not realized the significance of the position they had held, had not understood, in the moment, just how much depended on that narrow, dark corridor holding steady against the advancing enemy force. "I did not know that," he admitted. "I did," Drenna said, "and I am telling you now, because it matters." She paused, seeming to search for the right words. "I have not been fair to you since your arrival. I believed your presence undermined the seriousness of this unit's purpose. Today proved me wrong." It was not a full apology, not exactly, but it was more than Mark had expected, and he found himself simply nodding in acceptance rather than pushing for more. As the recruits began dispersing to rest and recover, Elena walked beside Mark toward the medical bay for a routine check, both of them quiet, processing the events of the day in their own ways. "You saved my life back there," Elena finally said, when that first soldier turned toward me. "You'd already hit them," Mark pointed out. "I just finished the job." "That is not how it felt from where I was standing," Elena said, a small, genuine smile crossing her tired face. "Thank you, Mark." It was the first time she had used his name so simply, without any formal title or careful distance, and something about hearing it settled a quiet warmth in his chest, despite the exhaustion weighing on every muscle in his body. Behind them, unseen, Commander Rook watched the pair walk away, her expression thoughtful as she considered the events of the day, the accidental recruit who had arrived confused and afraid, and the soldier who had stood his ground when it mattered most. She pulled up the recruitment log once more on her datapad, the red flag beside his name still blinking, still waiting for a decision that could no longer be delayed indefinitely. This time, her thumb did not hesitate over the report button. She pressed it. The summons came 3 days after the attack, delivered by a young officer who found Mark in the middle of a maintenance shift, repairing a damaged communication panel in one of the lower corridors. His hands still smelled faintly of the ship's strange, metallic cleaning solvent as he read the message on the small datapad the officer handed him. "Report to Fleet Command Chamber, Upper Deck 2, immediately. Recruitment status review." His stomach dropped. He had known this moment would come eventually, ever since Commander Rook had first mentioned the recruitment discrepancy on his very first day aboard the ship. Somewhere between the gravity drills and the raid and the slow, unexpected friendships that had formed along the way, he had almost managed to forget that his presence here had always been, officially, a mistake waiting to be corrected. Elena found him in the corridor outside the maintenance bay, her expression tight with the same understanding that now weighed heavily on him. "You received the summons," she said. It was not a question. Yeah, Mark said, setting down his tools slowly. I guess it's time. Time for what exactly? Elena asked, though something in her voice suggested she already feared the answer. I don't know, Mark admitted honestly. Maybe they're going to send me home. Elena was quiet for a long moment, her pale eyes searching his face for something he could not quite name. Would that be so terrible? She finally asked. Returning to your own world? Your own life? Mark considered the question seriously, more seriously than he expected to. A month ago, the idea of returning home would have brought nothing but relief, an end to the confusion and danger that had upended his entire existence. Now, the thought settled differently in his chest, tangled with everything he had gained since arriving, everything he was not sure he was ready to leave behind. I don't know anymore, he said quietly. That used to be an easy question. Elena reached out and squeezed his arm briefly, a small gesture of support that carried more weight than words could have managed. Whatever is decided, she said, know that this unit is better for your presence, whether the decision-makers realize it or not. The words stayed with him as he made his way toward the upper deck, through corridors that had become familiar over the past month, past training rooms and dining halls where recruits nodded to him now with genuine recognition, rather than curious staring. The ship that had once felt like an alien prison had slowly, without his fully noticing, begun to feel something closer to home. The fleet command chamber was smaller than he expected, a circular room dominated by a large table surrounded by high-ranking officers he did not recognize, their uniforms marked with insignia far more elaborate than anything he had seen among the Dravith sisterhood. Commander Rook stood near the entrance, and something in her expression, carefully neutral though it was, told him she had been waiting for him specifically. Recruit Delaney, announced one of the officers seated at the head of the table, an older woman with silver hair pulled back tightly, and eyes that seemed to assess him instantly and completely. I am Fleet Admiral Vesna. We have reviewed the circumstances of your recruitment, along with your subsequent performance during training, and the recent engagement at the outer perimeter. Mark stood as straight as he could manage, unsure whether to speak, or simply wait for whatever verdict was coming. The recruitment beacon that brought you aboard this vessel was calibrated incorrectly, Admiral Vesna continued, her tone matter-of-fact rather than accusatory. Your presence here was, without question, an unintended consequence of that error. Under standard protocol, such errors are corrected immediately, with the affected individual returned to their point of origin, and their memory of these events adjusted to prevent complications. Mark's heart sank at the phrase, memory adjusted, the implication settling heavily in his chest. Whatever decision followed, it seemed the option to simply remember this experience, to carry it home with him intact, was not guaranteed. However, Admiral Vesna continued, and something in her tone shifted slightly. Commander Rook's report on your performance, particularly during the recent defensive engagement, has raised questions about whether standard protocol serves the best interests of either party in this specific case. She gestured toward a data screen embedded in the table, which displayed a summary of the recorded events from the raid. Mark's actions during the corridor engagement highlighted in careful detail. You demonstrated combat capability well beyond what 1 month of training would typically produce, Admiral Vesna said. You protected a fellow soldier at personal risk, secured a critical defensive position, and did so without formal authorization to engage directly. These are not the actions of someone who does not belong within this unit's ranks. Mark glanced toward Commander Rook, who remained standing near the entrance, her expression giving away nothing of what she might be thinking or feeling about the proceedings unfolding before them. Given these circumstances, Admiral Vesna continued, Fleet Command has authorized an unusual option. You may choose to return to your homeworld, with your memory of these events removed, as standard protocol would normally dictate. Alternatively, given the unique circumstances of your performance and the unit's apparent willingness to retain you, you may choose to remain aboard as a formally recognized member of the Dravith Sisterhood, memory intact, fully integrated into the unit's ranks going forward. The room fell silent as the weight of the choice settled over Mark. He had expected, at best, a simple explanation, followed by an immediate return home. He had not expected to be given an actual decision, one that placed the entire trajectory of his future directly in his own hands. Can I have a moment to think? He asked, his voice steadier than he felt. You have until the end of this session, Admiral Vesna said. No longer. Fleet Command has matters beyond this single recruitment error requiring attention. Mark nodded, grateful for even the small window of time, and stepped toward the chamber's viewing window, staring out at the familiar field of stars that had become, somehow, less alien to him with each passing day. Commander Rook approached quietly, standing beside him without speaking for a long moment. You do not have to decide based on anything I might say, she finally offered, but I will tell you this. When you arrived, I considered you a liability, an accident requiring careful management until proper correction could be arranged. I no longer hold that view. What changed your mind? Mark asked. You did, Rook said simply. Your persistence during training, when every reasonable instinct might have told you to give up. Your instinct to protect Elena during the engagement, when a purely rational calculation might have told you to prioritize your own safety instead. These are not qualities a soldier can be taught easily. You either possess them, or you do not. Mark absorbed her words, thinking of everything the past month had brought him, the exhaustion and fear and confusion, but also the friendships, the growth, the strange sense of purpose that had settled over him despite everything. He thought of Elena's warmth, Drenna's grudging respect finally earned, even Tessu's harsh honesty that had, in its own way, pushed him to become better than he believed himself capable of being. He thought too of home, of the life waiting for him back on Earth, quiet and familiar but also, he now realized, somewhat empty in ways he had not fully recognized before this journey began. A steady job, a small apartment, few close relationships that demanded much of him, or gave much in return. It had been a comfortable life, but comfortable, he was beginning to understand, was not the same as fulfilling. If I stay, he said slowly, testing the words as he spoke them, what happens to my life back home? People will notice I'm gone. Fleet Command has methods of managing such concerns, Rook said. Your absence can be explained in ways that satisfy those who might otherwise search for you, without requiring your return. It is not a simple process, but it is possible. Mark nodded, absorbing this final piece of information, and turned to look back at the assembled officers waiting for his decision. He thought of the roof where this had all begun, the satellite dish he had been fixing on an unremarkable afternoon that had somehow led him across the galaxy to a life he never could have imagined. He thought of the fear of that first day, strapped into a chair among strangers who spoke a language he could not understand, and the slow, difficult journey from confusion to something that felt, unmistakably, like belonging. He walked back toward the table, standing straighter than he had at any point since arriving in the chamber. I want to stay, he said, his voice steady and certain, memory intact. I want to remain part of this unit. A murmur passed through the assembled officers, though Admiral Vesna's expression remained calm, as though she had anticipated this outcome all along. You understand this decision is permanent, she said. Once formalized, there will be no further opportunity to reconsider. I understand, Mark said. I've had a month to think about very little else besides where I belong. I know my answer. Admiral Vesna studied him for a long moment before nodding slowly. Then Fleet Command formally recognizes Mark Delaney as an official member of the Dravith Sisterhood, effective immediately, with full recruit status and all associated rights and responsibilities. The formal proceedings continued for a while longer, various administrative details discussed and finalized, but Mark absorbed little of it, his mind still processing the weight of the decision he had just made, permanent and irreversible, the final closing of one life and the true beginning of another. When the session finally ended, Commander Rook walked with him out of the chamber, her expression, for the first time since he had known her, carrying something that looked unmistakably like genuine warmth. You made the right choice, she said as they walked, though I suspect you already knew that before you spoke. Maybe, Mark admitted. It still feels strange. A month ago, all I wanted was to go home. And now? Rook asked. Mark considered the question as they walked, passing familiar corridors that had once felt alien and confusing, now simply the pathways of a life he had chosen, difficult and uncertain but genuinely his own. Now I think maybe home isn't always the place you started, he said. Sometimes it's the place where you actually became who you were meant to be. They reached the training deck to find Elena waiting near the entrance, her expression tense with anticipation as she spotted them approaching. Mark did not make her wait for the answer. "I'm staying," he said simply. The relief that broke across Elena's face was immediate and unguarded, and before Mark fully registered what was happening, she had crossed the distance between them and pulled him into a tight embrace, one he returned without hesitation. "I hoped you would," she said, pulling back slightly, her pale eyes bright, "but I was afraid to hope too much." "You saved my life during that raid," Mark said. "The least I could do was stick around to return the favor eventually." Word of his decision spread through the unit almost as quickly as the original rumors of his arrival had, though this time, the reaction carried none of the uncertain curiosity from before. Recruits stopped him throughout the following days to offer genuine congratulations, welcoming him properly now as one of their own, rather than a temporary curiosity passing through their ranks. Even Drenna approached him during a quiet moment in the dining hall, offering a stiff but sincere handshake. "I look forward to training alongside you properly," she said, "now that you are truly one of us." "I look forward to it too," Mark replied, and found that he genuinely meant it. Tessu's reaction remained characteristically blunt, though even she seemed to soften slightly upon hearing the news. "You still have much to learn," she told him during their next training session, her tone as demanding as ever. "Do not expect me to grow gentle simply because you have made your choice permanent." "I wouldn't dream of it," Mark said, and caught, just barely, the faint upward twitch at the corner of her mouth that might have been the closest thing to a smile Tessu was capable of showing. That evening, Mark returned to the observation deck where he had first spoken privately with Commander Rook weeks earlier, drawn by the same quiet pull that had brought him there before. The stars stretched endlessly beyond the window, the same view that had once represented nothing but fear and confusion, now settling into something closer to comfort, a reminder of just how far he had traveled, both literally and otherwise, since that ordinary afternoon on his rooftop. He thought about the life he had left behind, the quiet apartment and steady job that would soon fade into a carefully constructed explanation, tidy and unremarkable, satisfying anyone who might have wondered about his sudden absence. He thought about his family, distant enough that his disappearance would cause only a temporary ripple before life continued on without him, the way life always does. And he thought about everything ahead of him now, the training still incomplete, the friendships still deepening, the strange, difficult, genuinely meaningful life he had chosen over the comfortable emptiness of the one he had left behind. It was not the life he had imagined for himself, not something he could have planned or predicted, but standing there among the stars, surrounded by a unit that had somehow become his family, in the space of a single, unexpected month, he found himself entirely certain that he had made the right choice. Elena joined him a while later, standing quietly beside him at the window without immediately speaking, simply sharing the view in comfortable silence, the way they had come to do so naturally over the past weeks. "Regrets?" she finally asked. Mark thought about the question seriously before answering, turning it over fully in his mind one last time. "None," he said, and found, to his own quiet surprise, that he meant it completely. Not a single one. Outside the window, the stars continued their slow, silent drift, indifferent to the small, unlikely story unfolding within the ship. A satellite technician from Ohio, who had answered a beacon never meant for him, and found, against every reasonable expectation, exactly where he was always meant to belong.